This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
Atari was transforming the valley from dull engineer valley to exciting consumer electronics valley. I think Jack had a very undeserved bad reputation. He was one of the few guys, if anybody, maybe the only one, who knew how to take over this business.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. In this interview, we'll hear the perspective of an Atari outsider, a newspaper reporter who covered Atari. Jon Greer was a business reporter for the San Jose Mercury News newspaper from 1981 to 1986, and business reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle from 1986 to 1988. As part of his beat, he covered Atari, Chuck E. Cheese, and Catalyst Technologies, Nolan Bushnell's incubator. This interview took place April 17, 2015. I talked to Cassie Mass last week.
Right.
And she mentioned you, and she said that you were a business reporter at the San Jose Mercury News, and you gave her all sorts of interesting insight and feedback, previews about what was going to happen at Atari. You seemed to know what was happening before any of the employees did. And so I just thought it would be really interesting to talk to you as someone who was covering Atari back in that day to find out your perspective. You were covering Atari, and tell me about that. That's my open-ended question.
Sure. Okay. I was going to kind of orient you to the whole thing.
Please.
So back in the early 80s, and this is worth just saying, even if it's not for your, to include in the podcast itself, the coverage of Silicon Valley at that point was in its infancy, literally. The rise of Silicon Valley and how complicated the technology was, and this had been a farming area, and it was the Santa Clara area was just kind of sleepy, and in the early 80s, the Merc finally hired some people to cover a lot of this stuff. Not nearly enough even at that time, but we got a lot more coverage going. And so I was one of the first folks to be brought in to do that. I was just out of journalism school, but that's, I got the job anyway. Mm-hmm. Ended up covering Atari as part of, the electronics beat. I guess I had consumer electronics in some fashion when I was there. We didn't cover consumer. There wasn't nearly as much consumer tech as there is now. So that was only part of it in terms of all the other industrial stuff going on. Okay, so I think I can start here as far as what was happening is that in December of 1982, Atari was is that right? No, sorry about the date. Now I'm thinking, is that the right date? It feels like the right date. It was a huge company. It was one of the most important companies in the country. It was part of the Time Warner conglomerate, and at that time, it was the major driver of Time Warner's revenues. It was a national news story all the time. Atari
wasn't even Time Warner yet; it was still Warner Communications.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's right, Warner Communication. Right, you're going to be jogging. You're going to be, to the extent you can make my memory, not seem quite as foggy. That would be helpful. It's just a long time ago. A lot of happened in life and in general. I haven't talked about this much at all. Well, so do you know the part of the story where Atari got into some serious inventory problems when they made too many cartridges for a game? I can't remember which one it was, but whatever the most popular game.
Are you thinking of E.T.?
Right, the E.T. cartridge fiasco, right.
Right, it's kind of an infamous story.
Right, it's the beginning of the end. Mm-hmm. For the Atari that had been, so dominant in the late 70s and early 80s, was when they overproduced that. So actually what happened, you probably have had somebody's mentioned or about Ray Kassar, who had been brought in to be the CEO. So my colleague, Bruce Enton, have you heard that name?
No.
Was covering Atari actually, and interviewed Ray and did a huge story. And Ray, knowing that this big that a big shitstorm was going to come down. I can't think of a better word. hired Bruce more or less on the spot to be the new PR person for Atari. And he left the Mercury News and like literally within 2 days was on the other side representing Atari. And like within a day and a half, the news came out. And yeah, I just remember Bruce saying, "What have I done? I can't believe I did this." He then went on to have quite a career in Silicon Valley in marketing, so it all worked out for him. He became one of the top executives of LSI Logic, and it worked out for him. But it was, he one day he'd been a newspaper reporter, the next day he was in the middle of one of the biggest business stories in the country as the PR guy. Mm-hmm. And then because of that, we all shuffled around on the Merc, and I was suddenly covering this story. So now interviewing firing questions at my old friend who had been sitting next to me the day before, literally. So that was, the point being this is what I wanted to really emphasize. At that moment, Atari, like I said, was probably the biggest single business story in the country. Because it had, it was the new wave of consumer electronics, and it was going gangbusters, and it was feeding the Warner Communications beast, and then all of a sudden it got into trouble, as video game companies are well known to do.
What got it into trouble besides the fact that they overestimated the number of ET cartridges that they needed?
At that point, they were just, they were a bigger company than they could afford to be. And they had to start cutting people, right and left. And what I meant about video game cycles, and it's been a long time since I covered this stuff, and I hadn't thought about it till I started to say it a minute ago. At that time, and I don't know if this is still true, it was in the 80s, kind of a proven phenomenon that there was a boom and bust cycle in video games. It must have something to do with the popularity of different machines and different games. Mm-hmm. But Atari probably just got caught in we were really popular for a while, and then we made one mistake because we're kind of a hit-driven company, and now our income is not anywhere nearly matching our expenses. Mm-hmm. So that's what Cassie was referencing. And that, believe me, the employees knew a lot more than we did on some things, and we in the outside world knew a lot more than they were being told, on other things, mainly about how the business was going.
So how did you, as a reporter, know those things? Were you getting inside secret sources, or what were you doing?
No, it was really more from me as a business journalist. It was more talking to people outside the company who were following it and who didn't have, who weren't right there in the middle of Silicon Valley. So they were analysts and other people in the industry, and just sort of around the country, people were talking about Atari. And it's just that you put those things together, and those are the kind of things that they don't tell the employees till they have a staff meeting, and so that was pretty much where it was coming from. It was going fast and furious those days, so there was a lot of information going back and forth, about Atari in both directions, from employees and to them, and not so much that we reporters were feeding information into the company for any reason. It was just, like I said, an incredibly high-profile story. Everybody was talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Was the culture there, as far as you could tell, just the business culture, or whatever? Was it unique? Because the company just had so much money and it was in this new industry. Was this a new thing, or was this stuff that happened in business just all the time, just in other companies for millennia?
What do you mean, unique in what sense?
It seemed like they had more money than they knew what to do with, and maybe they were making bad decisions. Was this a new phenomenon, or just the first time that this industry had seen it?
It's actually a great question, and I would say, just the very end of what you said there, is it the first time this industry had seen it? I think it was, how I would look at it is it was one of the first times that Silicon Valley had seen it, because Silicon Valley, the reason it was called Silicon was because it was a semiconductor manufacturing area. That's how it started in terms of its big, huge electronics growth. So, the engineers who ran all the semiconductor companies and the equipment companies and the testing companies, those are engineer guys. They're not partying. And then Nolan Bushnell comes along and starts a consumer electronics company that basically becomes the biggest story in the area. Mm-hmm. It's a different environment. Yeah, it's a really different environment. There were probably other companies, certainly by the early 80s, there were the one that comes to mind is Activision. That was the big sort of outside cartridge producing company at the time. I can't speak to their fun culture, but I know, yeah, sure, that was gaining steam around here. Now we take all that stuff for granted, in spades, and it's crazy. But back then, yeah, I guess that's my point. I think that you're on the trail of maybe Atari was transforming the valley from dull engineer valley to exciting consumer electronics valley. I guess you could say to some extent Apple was doing that too, but I don't know anything about that culture, in terms of the parties or things like that with Apple. I doubt it was as big a deal. I mean, just to say, Nolan was quite the individual. Have you ever talked to him?
No, I've not.
Oh, you got to. I mean, that's your bigger than Ray Kassar. You got to get Nolan Bushnell.
Yeah, you're right.
Whenever I run into him around town every year, every few years, like, oh, John. I mean, I then covered Pizza Time Theater, Chuck E. Cheese, from beginning to bankruptcy court. So I was like on the Chuck E. Cheese beat, which was another company that was, in its day, an incredibly important company around here. It's kind of funny to say, but I'm kind of riffing here, but maybe it was like the new software app, it's sort of the same kind of thing of these very light technology things that are a big consumer idea, mm-hmm. and use technology to change things, versus the incredibly complicated, world of producing semiconductors.
Okay, let's talk Chuck E. Cheese for a minute. I think I and probably most of our listeners know the general story about Chuck E. Cheese, founded by Nolan Bushnell, and pizzas, and then eventually it crashed. Is there a story there, or some story there that maybe we don't know?
Well, I mean, just to put it in context, just because I've been around now long enough to have a really long view of Silicon Valley from the early 80s. That again, it was in its time for a year or two or three, a very important, influential company. And I say influential in the sense of, more as a business than as, there weren't a lot of Chuck E. Cheese's popping up to compete with them. Partly because if you think about it, the cost to entry is a lot higher than, two guys in a app development machine. So it was just, in its time, it was very important and, heavily watched, and it was a big success story for a while. But again, no disrespect to Nolan, I think he wouldn't argue with this. I mean, he is, he has a relatively unique place in Silicon Valley and in the electronics, culture that developed ever since the integrated circuit was invented, of being that, really fearless creator of ways to use these technologies, and just didn't have any fear about what he wanted to create. And this was one of the this was his next big hit, basically. Mm-hmm. Then he started one of the first incubators, the name of which is escaping me at the moment. So we covered the story of there was a robot that he was building, mm-hmm. and that was the big hit that came out of it. But I mean, most of it was just an incubator. I mean, now again, it's like incubators are everywhere. Back then, there was maybe one and this one, this one and another one, and it was a big deal. And it wasn't a complicated technology incubator. It was a really cool use of electronics incubator, mm-hmm. and he had like 10 different companies that he was seeding in there.
I like that question. I'm going to ask it again. Tell about Atari. Are there stories there that you think generally aren't known about what went on?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the big thing that happened was just how rapid what's the word? Decline was. That it may have just been. I think to some extent, it probably was a business that there was hardly anybody who would understand how to run it for a in a really tight ship kind of way for a good operating margin that would stabilize a company like that. So, and I didn't know Ray Kassar very well, but I know he didn't come out of this industry, and you can only imagine. And it's the thing, the forces that would be acting upon a company like that were probably not well understood by hardly anyone, if anyone at all.
Right.
And even a really good operator might not have been able to right the ship in any meaningful way. It probably just had to go down the way it did. I mean, that's the nature of discovery. There's a guy who I heard him lecture. I love telling the story. I really should Google him so that I can use his name, but I'll do that after this call. He's the guy who creates these undersea crawlers that crawl the ocean floor with cameras, and he actually watches them from around the world, and you can watch them on TV, on the internet, as they crawl along the bottom of not just the ocean, but other huge bodies of water, looking for stuff. And when he was doing this lecture, he said there was this point A to point B in the Black Sea, where I forget where it was going to and from, but like Turkey and something else. And it was just a straight line between these two ports. And he said, my crawler is there because there's thousands of ships that sunk going back and forth. It was a commercial route. That's the point. That's where I'm going here. Is that attempting to do things and establish a business order and business infrastructure, a lot of ships go down. And, we forget about that as time moves on. But, in this particular trade route, he wasn't looking anywhere else. He was looking right there because he knew that there would be thousands of ships going back and forth between these ports. And I'm into metaphors like that. And that's a good metaphor for Silicon Valley. And it's, one of the reasons is because the ship's captains just don't have the knowledge and technology to deal with, the world as they come upon it. And that's what happened in the Black Sea, whatever it was, 500, 1,000 years ago, and that's what happens out here all the time. And certainly Atari was a high-profile example of that.
All right. Is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have about Atari?
Well, how about the Jack Tramiel era? Is that beyond your...
No. If it was Atari 8-bit, Jack was still there for that era, and he released some more 8-bit machines in that time. So, how do you feel about Jack?
I think Jack had a very a very undeserved bad reputation, in hindsight. I think that, in fact, you could say, he was one of the few guys, if anybody, maybe the only one, who knew how to take over this business and run it like a narrow margin, whatever. I don't know if they even had narrow margins, but he knew how to manage a company. It's not, with all the sexiness around about running companies around here and investors throwing millions of dollars at people who don't know how to run companies. Running a business is boring and hard and involves, income statements and balance sheets and auditors and production things and, and dealing with vendors and all that stuff that you kind of intuitively know or you're familiar with wherever you are in business. But it's not sexy. And yet all these companies come out and we're a sexy company. We're busy running around taking meetings and stuff. Well, that is not the path much beyond startup and, gaining some visibility. And Jack was just the opposite of that. He's a hard-nosed, experienced businessman who took over a brand and took over a product line and did what he could to, make it profitable make it profitable. And so, at the time, he just seems like Darth Vader coming in. But in fact, you wouldn't, Atari's name would be even farther back in the reaches of time if Jack hadn't taken it over and done what he could with it. But yeah, like I said, culturally he wasn't much of a fit. Not just here, but just in general, he was just seen as a outcast or whatever the word would be. It's probably not a fair word to use, even just outside the norms of what was expected. So
that's a really refreshing take on Jack from what I normally hear, because I talk to employees who were laid off by him, and I talk to people on the Atari forums who are just like, oh, he released these machines that are poor quality, either because they were cheaper compared to the previous generation. And so Jack takes a lot of flack from all angles in the Atari community.
Right, from users and employees, of course. But, he was just trying to find a way to sell something at a profit. And he was unsentimental in those ways. So, yeah, that would be a culture clash between those parties and the people trying to run a business. And it's not that he necessarily was a nice guy running it, although I can't remember if I ever really even talked directly to him. I must have briefly at some point. He wasn't a barking, mean person in person. He probably just had a very different agenda than everybody else, or what people wanted him, the agenda people wanted him to have. Why do you lay people off? I mean, what, because you can't afford them, in one fashion or another. You got to look at the business structure to say, are they laying them off because, like some companies that get bought out, they're laying them off not because the only reason is to create better cash flow based on their sales. I mean, that's what all the buyout companies do, so that they can, as investors, take the money. That's not what Jack was doing. One of the interesting things, and you see this, like, this would be the Barry Bonds metaphor. He's sort of the designated boogeyman for all things that went wrong with the steroid era in baseball. Mm-hmm. But, what about Mark McGwire? I mean, he was Barry is, if the stories are true, Barry took a look at Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa having their home run chase, and he's like, those guys are in the home run chase? Well, I know they're juicing, and if I'm going to, beat them, I'm just going to be the best juicer. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, allegedly, Barry's never it's never been proven. So there's, some people just get a bad rep, and for whatever reasons, Barry, hard to deal with when he was a player, and, surly. Mark McGwire never, seemed different. You can also, I'm very into the cultural things, so black versus white. With Jack, Wall Street, waspy guy versus, Holocaust survivor, very different. Mm-hmm. And so, what came to mind was I covered, the era of when all the disk drive makers, as well as the semiconductor companies, moved their production offshore. Well, what do you think happened to their employees? They got laid off. Probably many thousands more got laid off when, and I'm thinking of Al Shugart when he was running Seagate. I covered the closing of those factories here in the area when he moved all his production to East Asia, just like everybody else has now done. Mm-hmm. But he certainly he didn't get the reputation that Jack Tramiel got. Why? I don't know exactly why, but some people are just designated boogeymen, and some people skate by and, glad hand people, and they're like, oh, well, we understand, so Al gets a bad rep for a year, but he doesn't end up being, we're talking about him 30 years later as somebody that people don't like. He's gone, passed away several years ago, but he didn't, it wasn't infamous when he passed away. He was like a pioneer when he passed away. I mean, he did invent the disk drive, but why did he move his production? Because to be competitive on a global scale, he needed cheaper production. It was just a business decision.
Great answer. Thank you.
Sure. That's all I can think of. Like I said, from the outside perspective, just a reporter's perspective on something that happened a long time ago.
Well, I appreciate it.
Find my clips, see if I had any that would jog some memories. I don't even have those anymore.
I'm sorry, you don't have clips, you said?
I don't have. I must have just. It must have been a bad day. I think I remember back where I tossed like 90% of my Mercury News clips from that period. And the reason being, like, it sits there in your box in a banker box in my house for 10, 20 years, and I never look at them, and they're dragging them around from house to house. I'm like, why do I have these things? Who actually cares? And I don't even know what's in here except for every 10 or 20 years I move them around and look at them for a moment. I just dumped the boxes of these things. And the only reason I thought of even that I owned them or thought I owned them was because I was talking to you. Well, how often do you think I'm having a meaningful conversation about stories I covered, not just BSing and what stories I remember?
Mm-hmm.
I felt like if I could find some things that I could, I'm sure there were stories like, oh yeah, I remember covering that story, but those clips are now lost to time.
Oh,
Unfortunately, they're lost to time because it was the pre-internet era, so I don't think they've uploaded in the Merc I think they uploaded some of them, but not many of the clips from that era from paper form into electronic form.
Yeah, I searched around for your name and Atari at Mercury News, and I got nothing, and which I thought was a little surprising because many years ago I subscribed to a Mercury service called Newshound, where it would, whenever there was an article that mentioned a certain topic, it would email you, and this was maybe 1991 or something, 1992, and at that point I had a search for the word internet because there were so few stories.
Right.
It would tell me about them all.
One thing is, it was all on microfiche. Excuse me. And I'm eating breakfast while we're talking. It was all on microfiche, and that's electronic to begin with. So you'd think, unless those microfiche themselves either degraded or can't be found, then in some sense, starting with the early '80s, even before, the Merc hired. Do you know Mike Malone?
No.
Heard of him? Mike Malone, the journalist. He was one of the very first journalists to come here and start covering electronics in the late '70s, which, believe me, there was a lot that had happened here of incredible import. No, I'm sure there's no clip anywhere in any newspaper ever. There probably was some in the trades, and some of those people, did Cassie turn you on to people like Scott Mace?
She sent me a list of people, and I'm just working down the list.
So. The list has got a ton of interesting people.
Yeah.
But the trades, the tech trades at that time were very important because they were the equivalent of today's, Google alert, whatever. Anytime somebody posts something, you go on Crunchbase, and for every press release that comes out, well, the trades, the electronics trades covered all that stuff, InfoWorld and et cetera. So there was probably some coverage, but Al Shugart invented the disk drive at IBM South San Jose, and it was the size of a ultra super giant pizza, whatever plate, not a plate, but platter, and it was 5 megabytes. The whole thing was 5 megabytes. But that's the kind of stuff that, who knows? It must have been the early '70s. Now hopefully that would be front page news. But back then, nobody was covering it at all in a mainstream way. But it would be interesting to get the microfiche from the Merc in the late '70s into the '80s, and get it all digitized for availability on the internet. We should mention this to Google because it's not just anywhere; it's covering Silicon Valley, for God's sake.
Yeah. Well, someone should get on that.
Yeah, I wonder if they exist. It's an interesting question. I don't know if the librarians, if that would be the place to go if you have any interest, is to whatever extent there still exists a library. We used to go in there like 5 times a day and ask the librarians to look stuff up for us. That's that they were central to our information gathering process. So if there's any librarians still around, either working or not, for the newspapers. They would know what happened to microfiche in some fashion.
Yeah.
More than anyone else, because they're the only ones who would probably care at this point.
Thank you so much, John. This is great.
Well, very good. Fun talking to you. Thanks for shaking loose some of the memories.
All right. Thanks, John.
Take care, Kevin.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.